Zoom is muted. If you would like to pose a question, you can do so through Menti. There is a link you could type in the browser and you can submit the question there. Hopefully, each question will be read aloud at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session. And not to forget, the Q&A session will be moderated by our very own Iro Hadzopoulou. ISACA members will learn upon completion 2 CPEs that will be uploaded automatically at the Gates, ISACA Engage site. And after that, you can report them following the startup procedure. Non-ISACA members that would like to receive a certificate of attendance will have to request so by sending us an email at info@isaca.gr. And at this point, I would like to call on stage the chapter's president, Mr. Nikos Drakos.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our hybrid event. As Spiro said, this is the first time after 2 years since the pandemic started that we are again together. We have people in the auditorium, we have people online, we have people from other chapters abroad that have joined us in this event. This is why we're speaking in English. So this is an international event for our chapter. I would like to thank Hellenic American Union for hosting us and doing whatever is required to have a successful event. So, as you already know, ISACA is focusing on digital trust. Digital trust is aiming to create confidence in people, processes, and technology. It is a necessity in a modern world that is reliant on ever-increasing connectivity, data use, and new innovative technologies. So ISACA is focusing on becoming the digital trust leader by correlating knowledge from different professions, such as cybersecurity, assurance, privacy, IT governance, risk, and is creating a fair, ethical, and transparent digital footprint. The introduction of emerging technologies, such as AI, is already creating huge value in our lives and in our companies when it is done well. As AI is involved in our everyday lives, we need to ensure we can design it to adopt ethical standards that foster trust. As time progresses, trust and safety in the exciting technology that is artificial intelligence is becoming increasingly more important and emphasized. To widen our knowledge on this topic, today we have with us Elena Chatzimichali, who is going to explain us how to build a responsible AI. So, on behalf of our board of directors, I hope that you will enjoy this event. Elena, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Yes, perfect. Thank you everyone for this very, very warm welcome and for the very brave of you that are here today. I'm super excited to be here and especially up on stage after 2 years of long COVID. And especially even more excited that I get to talk to you about this super important topic around AI fairness, explainability, transparency, and ethics, and how to best build a responsible AI. Now, today's topic is diving into some of the most important and sensitive topics that really affect our society. And the concept is not to create any at ease for us, like make us feel uneasy, but rather to create awareness and find ways of dealing with these sort of issues in an AI context. But first things first, a little bit about me and my background. So I come from a computer science background and I specialized in the field of machine learning and AI back in the day where it wasn't as hype and cool as it is nowadays. And after spending the first few years as an academic, collaborating and working for various research institutes in the UK, especially in the field of healthcare, I gradually jumped into financial services. And it was only about a year ago that I returned back to Greece, and I'm now part of Alpha Bank and its AI team under the Division of Growth and Innovation. Over the past 10 years, I've been also actively involved in lecturing and creating content for both academic and professional audiences around the fields of AI, and participated in various machine learning conferences and events. So hopefully I get to know what I'm talking about today and you get to enjoy it. And finally, a little bit about my research interests. I work around a broad spectrum of machine learning applications, mostly around recommender systems, time series forecasting, NLP, and last but not least, today's topic around fate. The agenda for today is split in two parts. The first one is a bit more introductory, setting and covering the principles around fate and what fairness is all about, the problem with bias and how to best mitigate it. Then we'll take a quick break. Same thing applies for those of you that are joining us from Zoom, and follow up with accountability, the ethical and like the responsibility aspect immediately after. Towards the end of the session, we also have a Q&A, and if you want to post any of your questions, keep your questions please towards the end of the session. And if you may, you can post them in the link provided here. I'll repost that during the break. And I believe it's also posted on Zoom. Just a quick disclaimer, the material and opinions that are going to be stated and discussed today are my own personal views, and in no way, shape, and form they reflect either my previous or current professional affiliations. And in a context that I discuss a lot about objectivity and subjectivity, I'll try to remain as neutral as possible, backing all these findings with real world examples and provide research articles, online sources, and publications where it's possible. So without any further ado, let's just jump right into it and discuss about AI. First and foremost, what is AI? I'm starting from the very basics because I know some of you may be coming from a completely different field and domain. So AI is the field of computer science that is trying to mimic the functionality of the most important, powerful, and versatile organ of humans, none other than the human brain. So we want with AI to mimic the cognitive functionalities of that of a human. Machine learning and its more powerful subset, deep learning, gives computers the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. And what does that mean? As opposed to typical programming where we give a set of if-then-else statements and reach a consensus or a decision, we want machine learning algorithms, which is pretty much what we're going to be discussed today when we're talking about AI applications. So we're going to be referring to machine learning. We want to give them the ability to learn by themselves, learn by experience, and this experience takes the form of data and their own mistakes towards reaching decisions, predictions, or any other type of actionable intelligence. As I mentioned, these algorithms learn, or we get to feed them with prior knowledge in the form of data. So data science as an interdisciplinary field is the one that uses methods, algorithms, and processes to really break down structured and unstructured data and convert them into actionable intelligence. And it's not a shock to anyone in this room that we live in an era of big data where tremendous amount of information is accumulated on a day-by-day basis. And this type of data is just too hard to process using traditional methods. Hence the need for AI. And it's true that AI applications now are omnipresent, encompassing almost all aspects of our daily lives. So AI algorithms on a day-by-day basis tell you what sort of news to read, where you should dine, which restaurants are most to your likeliness, where to, which music to listen to, and also who you get to date. To the point that it is predicted that by 2030, AI may contribute around 15.7 trillion to the global economy. But of course, with great power comes great responsibility. And it's not just about the hype, it's not just about the sunshines and the rainbows. So often than not, and especially during the recent years, there have been a lot of challenges and risks when it comes to the applications of AI that have made some of the most famous headlines. So let's look, for example, Amazon a couple of years ago wanted to automate their CV screening process, their recruiting process, and they created a tool that over time, it showed that it was discriminating heavily against women. Now, how did that happen? If we were to consider in this case the target, it's my phone. Apologies for that. So if we were to think of the audience of the people that would apply to Amazon, that would be mostly male dominated, coming from certain socioeconomical backgrounds, and mostly with education that would be coming from either engineering or computer science. Now, this problem was so hard to solve that Amazon had to completely scrap off this recruiting tool with a fear of having this bias. Google also, a couple of years ago, when it came to their face detection and their labeling of pictures, mistakenly tagged Black people as gorillas. That was because their models were not trained on enough instances and enough pictures of Black people. Therefore, it kind of caused this issue. And last but not least, Microsoft created a bot that they released on Twitter, and they allowed it to communicate and engage with a wider audience, believing that people are always of good nature and nothing wrong can go bad. However, within a single day of the bot being released, it started immediately interacting with people and started becoming super duper racist. Now, Microsoft said, okay, we'll fix it. They took it offline, they fixed it. Within a day of releasing it again, racist comments were back up again. So it's a very difficult problem to solve. And this is truly just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of headlines nowadays, and the problem becomes more and more apparent. However, the key question that we need to focus here is, why should we care? Why, as in why the society, and why in terms of the business? If you're a business and you find yourself against those sort of like very impactful headlines, it may lead to actually lawsuits and legal actions against you and regulatory investigations. Worst case scenario, you may even get some monetary penalties and fines, as happened around 2022, just earlier this year, where the Hungarian Data Protection Authority issued the largest fine to date, around 670,000 euro, to a bank for the unlawful use of AI. And they were just trying to analyze the sentiment of their customers. So we need to be really careful. But the worst and most important issue of them all is the reputational and brand damage. Companies make efforts over years to build the trust, to earn the trust of their customers. And it only takes one headline or something going wrong to completely lose that trust and never be able to repair that the bond yet again. So once the trust is lost, that may mean that your clientele may be lost as well, and that may have a direct impact on your business. As a society, as we all know, there's a lot of mistrust when it comes to AI and conflicting views, even nowadays, after years of being in that hype. So things like that may only increase that mistrust towards how AI is being used. And last but not least, the impact and the harm that it may actually have on human lives. So what if your life completely depended on the outcome and the decision-making process of an AI system, as was the case with law enforcement? So Compass is probably the most famous AI example that became very famous or infamous, if you wanted, because of a bias. So Compass, just to give you an idea, is a software which is even nowadays widely used by the US courts, by judges, to assess whether a defendant is likely to reoffend as soon as they release them out of jail. And what happened in this case is that each prisoner was assigned a score based on their prior commitments. And what you will see is that people that were Black, of African-American descent, they were assigned a higher score, even though, for instance, they may have done a petty theft as opposed to someone who's white, who were assigned a lower score, even though their offenses were a lot more severe, such as domestic violence, as opposed to the ones from the African-American background. And what is even more important here to note, and I would like you to keep that in mind for what's coming up next, is that in this particular case, race and gender weren't even inputs in the model building process. So they weren't part of the data that were fed in the model. But AI excels amazingly well at finding those hidden features that can act as proxies for those sensitive attributes. Now, when it comes to business, let's look at a more recent example and think about how does where you live, or does where you live actually influence how you live? And this is an example from 2016 and the Amazon same-day delivery that was bypassing certain zip codes in some of the biggest US states, where, especially in those areas, large African-American populations used to live. Now, someone may consider, okay, but that is a luxury. But what if you live in areas that are considered food deserts, where you don't have access to a very close supermarket nearby, and it's not easy to provide for your family or find groceries? So that immediately has a direct impact on your life. But what is more eerily and shocking here is the fact that if we look, for instance, at Chicago and look at the picture on the left and on the right, which is from the 1938 Homeowners Loan Corporation, they look eerily similar. So in 1938, what happened is that banks were creating red lines, and that's how redlining became about, around areas of higher risk and of people that didn't have enough money, as opposed to the greener and more yellow areas where people could potentially be more affluent, and therefore they could provide them with loans or mortgages. So you can see that pretty much like this stereotype may have creeped over the years, despite redlining now being banned. Another case that haunts us nowadays, I would have to say, is the spamming of fake news that throughout social media especially has escalated and has boomed over the previous years. But if you think that fake news is a problem, here come deepfakes. So someone, and I did try it earlier today, I showed it to my mom and she's like, oh, why do you have Obama? But this is not Obama. This is a deepfake of Obama. So with deepfakes, and I encourage you to watch that video at home because you'll be surprised by the things fake Obama says. So with deepfakes, what's happening is like we take advantage of deep learning. Remember, this is AI, and fake images. So we create AI-generated, highly realistic to the point of deceiving synthetic images. So these are fake images, fake videos, and fake audios generated by a technique called GANs. And the idea is like you take a person of interest and another person that can be an actor, and you face swap, or you manipulate their characteristics. So at the end, it would look very much like the real deal, such as President Zelensky. But for the trained eye, you can notice, for instance, these deepfakes not blinking, or a difference in between the neck and the face, the rotation. But there are teams throughout the world, academic teams, that specialize in these sort of problems. And I have to admit, sometimes it's very difficult to tell them apart. So what is the danger here? As happened with the case of Zelensky, a realistic deepfake video of the Ukrainian president, it actually showed up in the Ukrainian side, government side. It was hacked. And it said, let's surrender our arms and everything. But it was easy at the time for the trained eye to detect it as fake. However, the threat still remains. So imagine if a day or a week before elections, a deepfake video came to your email or to your YouTube feed, and you were almost tempted to watch it, but you cannot tell that it's a fake video, and kind of changes your mind. So deepfakes pose a problem deeper than just copyright controversy. They tend to go viral and increase polarization. They have a tendency, if successful, to manipulate elections. They can create hard to repair reputational damage, especially for the person that is featured in a video. They undermine journalism because they're being used as a means of fake news. But even worse, they can weaponize technology, jeopardize public safety and national security, and distort democratic discourse. So I hope these examples, and these are just a few of them, we'll see a lot more as we go along, kind of set the scene and raise the importance on why FATE is important. And FATE stands for the acronym of fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. And yes, you may see a lot of permutations such as FAT or FATS, but the essence is one. These are some of the key pillars that we want to focus on when it comes to building responsible AI. But taking it one step further, why is responsible AI important? Because on the back of that, we want to build trust, a trustworthy AI that whoever is interacting with that AI algorithm and model has a faith and trust into its capabilities, and making sure that it's acting beneficially, ethically, and most important, fairly. So let's jump into fairness. And this is probably my favorite slide throughout the whole presentation, because it very much highlights the story around fairness as a research field. So a couple of years ago, it was only, I would say, a couple of academics that would focus on issues and concepts around AI fairness. And ever since AI has dominated and has expanded into pretty much each and every single level and application of our lives, we can see at the time of writing, that was 2017, but that the problem of fairness started becoming increasingly real. And a lot of the major tech companies, governments, including academics, of course, they really have to focus on solving and mitigating these sort of issues. So fairness of AI algorithms, as I mentioned, is a growing field of research that arises from the general need for algorithmic decisions to be free from bias, stereotyping, and unfair discrimination. And a lot of the times when we refer to AI fairness, there's an immediate connection to bias. Users want to trust ML models and expect them to be fair. Why is that? Because we consider a machine to be free from emotions and be less judgmental than us humans. Therefore, they must be more objective. It's not really the case, though. And by fair in this case, we mean not to systematically discriminate, and especially not to cause harm, especially when it comes to legally protected groups and minorities. But it's never that simple. Unfair AI systems produce decisions that, on the back of these decisions, certain groups, for instance, let's consider more sensitive groups based on race, on gender, they get to disproportionately get impacted. So remember, in the case of Amazon and the recruiting automation, women were disproportionately impacted when it came to their CVs being screened. And as I mentioned, fairness and bias do mean different things to different people. Bias does not only have a negative side of it, it can be both fair and unfair. So biases in our lingo can also be that extra signal, that statistical pattern we're looking for in an individual, that upon which we can build a model. However, when it comes to fairness discussions, I will get to use bias in the negative concept, in which case AI bias leads to prejudice assumptions, especially when the data, remember that we're learning by experience, the data that we feed into these models are skewed by some sort of sensitive attributes such as race, gender, education, and wealth, among others. AI will not only pick up on those kind of stereotypes, prejudices, and biases, but at times it may even be capable of amplifying the problem, that bias, and making the problem even bigger. But in order to address bias, we have to take a step back and realize that AI bias isn't just a technical problem, but it's a societal problem. So with that, let's think of an example. Back in 2015, a Google image search, if you went on Google and search for the term CEO, you will see quite a stereotypical result coming back. So a lot of male dressed in suits, some of the techie ones also dressed in Zivagos. But what I want you to note here is that the first CEO that actually is returned that is female, the bottom corner, and it's none other than CEO Barbie. That doesn't make us look good. So only 11% actually of the people displayed at the time were women, despite 27% of the US chief executives being female. And the question that is risen here is, okay, even if we were to fix the problem, how do we know that our results are unfair? Who gets to decide the proportion and especially the ranking that you get to demonstrate these women as a result? But it's not just that. I wonder like how many of you have pondered when it comes to our digital assistants. So Alexa, Siri, Cortana, and so on and so forth. Why do you think they have female voices and female names? Of course, yes, female voices could be a lot easier. It's actually scientific research to listen to. But again, it's a very much of a bias explicitly being embedded into an AI, which is none other than the gender of the most popular AI assistants. So when it comes, as I mentioned, the first step, and we get to see how biases can be found, can be detected and mitigated throughout the AI lifecycle, the first step is always looking at the data. This is the first source. And sources of data bias could start first and foremost from the choice of attributes that we possess. When you're a business stakeholder, when you're a developer, when you're a data scientist, it's your job to keep asking questions around how did I collect my data? What sort of data do I have? Do I notice anything that is of sensitive nature? And how can I make the most out of it to protect it from biases? So the choice of data, and that can be broken down into either featuring sensitive attributes such as the age, the gender, the income, the ethnicity, the address, could be all considered sensitive attributes that if we can get away without having, even better. But very similarly, omitting these critical attributes that influence the outcome may also lead to biases. And let's not forget that even with our best intentions, excluding attributes, especially sensitive attributes that may be correlate, these attributes may be correlated with other attributes that act as proxies in the data. So AI is amazing when it comes to finding those hidden features that act as proxies for sensitive information. Second of all, the data collection and sampling. Of course, it would be ideal if we had a representation of each and every one of us in this world and every instance in this world, but of course that cannot happen. So what we tend to do is collect or sample data. And this may lead into issues of either certain groups being underrepresented, or overrepresented. So we need to be in the lookout of these imbalances in the data. The third is more of a human element, and it can be split into our developers and the people involved, kind of feeding in the models and the data their unconscious biases. Now, this can be generated either unconsciously or in a malicious, intentional, and manipulated way. So remember, it's not always that we act in the best intention. So we need to be on the lookout for these issues. So let us look at some of these examples of data biases. The first one is a historical bias. Historical biases arise when the AI that is trained today is not really accurately reflecting the society and the reality as it is nowadays. And for that, there is an example from 2016. It's mainly an NLP case that I'm going to refer to. And it showed that man is to computer programmer as a woman is to a homemaker. So what happened in this case, when we're talking about NLP and dealing with text, we transform these words into what we call word embeddings, numerical representations that we feed into our models to learn. So by doing so, the model that was trained on past Google News and actually watching interviews from Google, it went all the way back to using even cases from the Bible. It managed to replicate and perpetuate these sort of gender stereotypes. That problem became even more apparent for Google Translate. And at this point, I have to raise that Google Translate is the most, I think, like the grandest AI tool, the most important AI tool in the world today, used by billions of people and across different languages. So one of the issues that happened in this case is especially for languages that were neutral or ambiguous, such as Turkish, when it came to translating some of the professions like doctor or nurse, the automatic translation picked that he is a doctor and she is a nurse. And there's a reason for that, because for several thousands of years in writing, we had male being male doctors and female nurses. So of course, that sort of gender stereotype kind of was amplified and was carried on in the machine learning process. And later on in the ethical section, we'll get to see how Google went about to solve this sort of issue. Second data bias, as I explained, is selection bias or sampling and representation bias. And this is the case where one population, for instance, race or gender, is either excluded, under, or overrepresented in the data. So there was a Nature publication from 2019 where it showed that millions of Black people were affected by a bias in healthcare algorithms. This is a widely used algorithm in the US that it gets to allocate healthcare to patients that have been systematically discriminating against Black people. Now, the algorithm kind of used the healthcare spending that these patients had done up to that point as a proxy for medical needs. The higher the costs that they had done in hospitals, the more sick these patients were considered. The problem, though, was that by the time that Black people were referred for more specialized treatment, they were already a lot sicker than the white people. And only 17.7% of the patients the algorithm assigned for that extra care were Black. And the researchers that actually conducted this research and found those imbalances, those biases, they mentioned that the proportion would have been 46.5 in case that the algorithm was in fact unbiased. Third case of a data bias, and these are just some of the biases that we need to be on the lookout for, has to do with outliers. And I'm going to use outliers in the statistical machine learning sense. And let's see one of those cases that affects, though, billions of people globally, which are living with some form of disability. And this is actually a bias that is not often discussed, and it's omitted from the AI bias conversations. So disabled people have been subject to both historical and present-day marginalization, and many people, as a result, choose not to disclose this disability. Now, when we have these sort of statistically small groups, for example, of disability, or in the case of business, it could be a case of older people or based on other characteristics, we may actually statistically treat them as outliers, as in that noise in the data that we have to conveniently remove rather than dealing with that. So this, in fact, is leading to an extra exclusion. And disabilities on their own are extremely diverse, dynamic, and heterogeneous. So even within the same disability, you may have a lot of different cases, a lot of different significant differences. Imagine if you were to build a bot, an assistant, and it didn't factor in people that had a stutter, and that would cause a massive problem for your business and, of course, for the individual that is being affected on the back of that. As I mentioned, these were only 3 of the cases of data biases that we are dealing with, and they mainly creep in from the real world. But especially in the auditing business, you have to be on the constant lookout for biases throughout each and every single step of the AI lifecycle. That can happen during the model building process, the training process, even when it's down to releasing those findings to the wider world. So with that, we have my favorite type of bias, which is confirmation bias. It's one of those cognitive biases. And I have to admit, confirmation bias can be a data bias as well. So if someone has set views on what sort of data they would like to collect, this can also be an issue. But confirmation bias on the back of, here's a machine learning model that gives you some results. What's happening in this case is that we consume information and facts, and if they contradict our prior and our existing beliefs, we just choose to ignore them. That apparently has become even worse over the last few years, where social media, misinformation, fake news all came about, enter deepfakes. So we choose to exclude information that conveniently doesn't fit into our prior beliefs. And in this case, we take it a step further and we look for information and evidence that it kind of reinforces those prior beliefs. And this is mainly driven by our ego, because people do love being right. But again, in the wrong hands, imagine if we were to keep feeding you personalized information that would just keep reconfirming that bias. That would be totally wrong and unethical. So when it comes to mitigation, we saw a couple of examples of biases, but it's not that simple. And that's because we as human beings are quite complex. And I love this, this diagram because it shows around 180 at the time of writing different biases, cognitive biases that people have on a day-by-day basis. And it's impossible to really deal with each and every one of them. So fairness, biases, stereotypes, prejudices are in fact a very complex issue. So we saw a lot about how to deal with a lot about the background and issues with biases. Now let's start discussing how we can best start mitigating them. So the first thing I would advise is, especially if you're a business, is start with the people. This is strictly not a technical issue. This is a society issue. So human judgment is important and is needed to ensure the AI decision-making is fair. Work with domain experts and those impacted. And by those impacted, it's not, for example, in a healthcare situation, it's not just working with the doctors, but that includes also the people that get affected. That means the patients. Try to include as many people from diverse backgrounds as possible throughout those discussions. Create cross-functional and cross-disciplinary teams. That would mean have a combination of technical expertise, legal, social, and ethical expertise, just to name a few. It also varies from industry to industry and from company to company. And try to increase and maintain diversity in the workspace. So things like gender biases, for instance, it could be picked up if, for instance, you had a woman in the team screening for these results. Similarly, with cases of disability or other cases like that. A minority group is always a good point to start. Remember, though, the responsibility does not just lie at the top, the C-suite. All of us in that pipeline, engineers, designers, product managers, all have to acknowledge the data that are used I keep asking questions around the why and the how these were collected. Advocate for good policy and be on the constant lookout for these biases. And please don't be afraid to ask the tough questions. When it comes to data, so we saw part of the process is involving the right people across an industry, organization. Second part is dealing with the actual data. So instead of trying to make a machine learning system completely unfair or debiasing, which was the initial notion when it came to a fairness discussion. Nowadays, what we want to achieve is first detect and mitigate fairness-related harms, not just biases, but something that may cause harm and an unfair treatment for a specific use case under study. Ask the right fairness questions. As before, I'll keep saying that. Keep going back into the question asking mode. Is it fair? And if it's fair, fair for whom? Is my fair your fair? And if it's not, whose neutrality are we going to use? Do use representative data and be intentional about the data collected. A common mistake is that more data may automatically solve the problem, but in fact, more data doesn't necessarily mean less bias. Try to actively look for the sources of bias in the data by asking questions around how it was and understanding how it was collected and sampled, and really look into the people that collected the data, because even unconsciously, through annotation or through collection, some biases may have creeped in. So again, the information that we feed into these AI algorithms should be diverse and inclusive, and make sure that your data are current and timely. If you were to train your model on outdated data, let's say from the 70s, they're not going to help you solve today's problems. They're not going to be representative of the situation and the society as it is nowadays. Third step, I would say, for mitigating biases is using some publicly available open source tools. So for instance, there are a lot of AI fairness tools out there that are using statistical methods to identify those biases. Quite a lot of them come from the biggest tech companies such as IBM, Microsoft, Google, and Facebook. There are, I would say, the key players that everyone's looking up to. And these tools are quite impressive when it comes to detecting biases across, as you will see in the figure from the IBM AI fairness tools, one of the first ones to be released, throughout the whole life cycle of AI. However, and I do need your attention when it comes to that, these computational methods may not account for the ethical and sociocultural complexities that are apparent in the world that we live in. And for an AI algorithm, it's extremely difficult to distinguish between bias as a metric from discrimination and any notions of justice, just when we report it back as a technical term. So this is the reason why I wanted to start with the people first and foremost when it comes to mitigating bias. And having a good, diverse, inclusive team is of paramount importance. Do include people from different backgrounds, different expertise, because only then you can start looking at this problem from a different angle. The fourth one is processes. So we saw how it is to deal with people, to have a diverse team, to treat the data. Now let's have a look at some of the processes. So what is advised is that you document processes and your considerations, including priorities and trade-offs that you may have taken throughout the whole model building process. This definitely allows for auditability and transparency later on, and to be able to answer those tough discussions. Do use quantitative and qualitative approaches and tools to help facilitate these processes. And please do remember that these tools do not necessarily guarantee fairness. One of the other aspects that we'll see later on throughout the course is that we need to be constantly thinking about the model transparency and its explainability. We need to be able to give humanly explainable information on why our model is making certain predictions. And that may actually help us towards the detection and the removal of such biases. Of course, that's a lot easier said than done. And there's a lot of active research when it comes to this field, as we'll see very, very soon. Think like an auditor or do audit. Scrutinize all the predictions of your model, compare and contrast prediction metrics, especially across different subgroups, legally protected subgroups, as I mentioned before, with sensitive characteristics could be always a good place to start, and see what sort of questions, what sort of answers you get out of that. And a golden rule is that any AI tool that you build it, you tested it, you're happy, the metrics look as they expect, and you release it into production. However, your job does not stop there. An AI tool put into production still needs to be continuously monitored to ensure it remains fair and representative and of good standards. Fairness does not stop once our work around the development and the implementation is stopped. It's an ongoing process. Now, for these processes, there has been some work very recently around standardizing them. One of them is called datasheets for datasets. It was proposed by Microsoft along with some other collaborators. And the idea is like for any data set that you may contain within your line of business that you intend on using it for machine learning practices and building a model on the back of that, you escort it with a data sheet that describes this data set. Now, this is effectively a template that gives you a breakdown and asks some of the questions. It's a standardized format and asks some of the questions around the background of the data, some risk-related data, even some ethical and legal information can go into filling this data sheet. And the reason around that is to mitigate unwanted societal biases, to allow greater reproducibility, and to increase transparency and accountability, which we'll see very, very shortly. So with that, I think it's time for our quick break. I hope you enjoyed the first part. And I believe we said around 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll reconvene. Okay. Cool. Okay, so welcome back for the second section. I hope you've all enjoyed the first one. I got some reinforcement, some positive reinforcement, which is good. Made me happy. And let's jump into a different section, which is around accountability. Let's look at a use case around autonomous vehicles or self-driving cars, which is a massive and very profitable business. Autonomous vehicles market was valued around 45 billion in 2019 and is projected to reach around $557 billion by 2026. But unfortunately, something went terribly wrong, and in 2018, an Uber self-driving car hit one of the pedestrians, later causing a fatality. So what happened behind the scenes, and as you can see, the view of the self-driving system about 1.3 seconds before impact, is that the algorithm initially, the AI algorithm initially flagged the object, the unknown object that was detected in front of the self-driving car as an unknown. Then it changed to a vehicle, bicycle, and then a pedestrian, instead of like a pedestrian walking a bike. And that can be a massive issue. So what if we have cases of disabled people that may happen to be in front of self-driving car like that the algorithm is not able to detect? But on the back of that, what happens on the back of these sort of fatalities, these sort of very difficult and ugly accidents? Could you sue a robocar? And if not, who could be held legally liable? And in this case, I should kind of mention that legal liability, accountability, and responsibility are often interlinked and used instead of one another. And could causality be established? Now, in this particular case with Uber, the prosecutors decided that the company was not criminally liable for the pedestrian's death. There was also a standby driver behind the wheel that they got a little bit detached of what's going on in the road because they were screening against their phones. So it was now down to the company to be liable for this particular death. A different spin now on responsibility and accountability, which is one of my favorite cases, is art which is generated by AI, as is the case of Edmond de Bellamy, which is apparently now a whole phenomenon, a whole movement. This particular painting that you get to see here is an AI-generated painting. It's a portrait, a blurry portrait, but it's totally synthetic. And it was the first one to be auctioned and sold at Christie's in London for this staggering amount of $423,500, but you get the gist, dollars. Initial estimations for that piece were around 10,000. Now, the AI model in this case was fed and learned, remember the learning process, through thousands and thousands of portraits, effectively teaching it how to represent Renaissance pictures and portraits of the 18th century. However, the work on the back of that is the result of the algorithm's own imagination. No one actually took a brush and fixed the painting. And while obvious, this is the Arts Collective claimed responsibility for all 11 portraits in the Bellamy series. It was in fact a teenager that was the first one that had previously developed and uploaded his code on GitHub. But if we were to consider it art, who has the rights to this art? Is it the AI itself? Is it the group that owns the AI and therefore the painting? The coder of the algorithm? And if so, who gets credit? And in this case, I have to mention that, in fact, the money went to the Arts Collective and none of the developers actually got the credit and so on and so forth. The company actually mentioned that their work was based upon previous work. And yeah, I'll let you to read more about it because it's actually very interesting. So accountability in this case means that each and every single person involved in the creation of AI is considered accountable. and the need to consider the system's impact in the world, the society. And in the same process, so are companies accountable that are invested in an AI application and development. Accountability effectively means that there are effective governance and oversight mechanisms for each and every one of the AI projects that we're running. Companies need to make their policies clear and easily accessible to development teams as AI developers, data scientists, and machine learning experts. It's our responsibility as well to know, in case we don't know what sort of policies we have to adhere to. It's not like we can go out in the wind and do whatever we want. And we need to understand where our responsibility and the responsibility of the company and the software ends. Again, remember that once it's out there, you may not necessarily have a control over how the data or the tool may be used by a user. Remember the case of the Microsoft bot that became a racist, despite the company's best intentions. Keep detailed and accessible records of all your design processes and decision-making, especially important for auditing and for transparency purposes. And adhere to a company's business conduct guidelines. And we'll see a lot more about guidelines in the ethics part as well, coming later on today in the last section. Understand national and international laws, regulations, and guidelines that your AI may have to work with. Do advise some publicly available accountability frameworks, such as the one from the US government that we'll see in a little bit. And think like an auditor, and especially in a room full of auditors, also the ones at home, they should be amazing to hear. So there's quite a few accountability frameworks. Again, it very much varies from between governments and company and split all across the world. US Government Accountability Office developed a framework to help assure accountability throughout the entire AI lifecycle. And they're mainly focused on 4 pillars that have to do with data, governance, performance, and its monitoring. And even though this was initially fixed for government purposes, it could easily, from its creators, they mentioned that it can easily be adjusted and applied for company purposes. But what I want you to remember as well is that accountability goes almost hand in hand with transparency and explainability. So let's see the next section around transparency. What do we mean by being transparent? Let's take, for example, a loan officer that wants to understand why the model is recommending a particular credit being approved or denied. Or even worse, the example that I get to refer to, and hopefully I don't get to annoy anyone either here or at home, is that you get your newly inflated electricity bill, and there's some adjustment that leads to this crazy amount, and you're wondering, but why? It's very important to be transparent around the decision-making, especially if it's driven by an algorithm. And unfortunately, current AI algorithms are considered what we call black boxes. These black boxes are models which are impossible, even for us developers that we know what we're talking about and we're dealing with this on a day-by-day basis. These models are impossible to interpret, to open them up and see the logic around them. But technology must be transparent and explainable. For the transparency element, and I'll jump into the explainability in a short bit, but for the transparency element, we saw previously for the data mitigation, an initiative which was called datasheet for datasets. So for every single dataset in your company that you want to feed into machine learning algorithm, you escort it with a datasheet, which is a standardized piece of text that kind of covers some of the important areas around risk and try to minimize biases in the back of that. Very similar approach, which was built and proposed, I believe by Google, is to have model cards, which are used for model reporting. And this is a standardized documentation, but for machine learning models that you have already trained and possibly even released. And this gives you a transparency because you cannot stress enough how important this is. I used to do that a lot in the past because you have a documentation where either other members of your team or your stakeholders, they can understand what's going on behind the scenes. You explain what the model does, its intended use and audience, who will get to ingest or be affected by the decision-making progress of the algorithm, and who gets to maintain it going forward, insight into the construction, and last but not least, metrics and its overall performance. And these model cards can complement very nicely the datasheet for datasets that we saw before. Taking it a step further, explainability and the whole movement, the whole research field of XAI, as that stands for explainable AI, is opening these AI black box models. So making those black box models transparent with explainable AI. In its simplest form, AI takes inputs and generates an output. That is a prediction or a decision. With these black models, the end user remains kind of puzzled on why did you get the result you get? I don't believe you. I don't trust you. I do not know what's going on behind the scenes. But explainable AI comes as a way of stepping in and creating an explainable model with an explainable interface that can be understood by us. The idea is like to create some human interpretability. And I know that there's a bit of a debate when it comes to the right of explanation. I believe some people do say that it's part of GDPR. Some people say it's not actually stated in the GDPR, but there is a right of explanation for all of us. And it's a good idea to always incorporate that, especially when you're working even for heavily regulated industries. So the explanations can be to your end user. The explanations can be for your business stakeholders on a day-by-day basis at work. The explanations can be for your auditors and your regulators, but it's a good idea to always feature explanations. And some of the examples from nowadays, mostly around recommender systems. So for instance, on one hand side, you have LinkedIn, and on another hand side, you have Netflix. And I swear after this presentation, you will never see your apps in the same way before, is that you have explanations. So for instance, it says people you may know at this particular company or a particular university, or because it justifies how other people with your similar background and profile or other movies you may have watched are similar to the ones that we're recommending. And by featuring this explainability, these explanations, it almost creates an even bigger eagerness for the users to interact and engage with that online content, buy new products, and in general, boosts that user engagement. So as I mentioned, explainability, or XAI, as we call it, is a set of processes that allow humans to comprehend and trust is on the backbone of everything we do, the results and output as they are created by machine learning algorithms. Transparency might be important because it allows those affected by a decision to either challenge it or change the outcome. So imagine if you go in a bank, and again, that example is random, not based on my experience, but if you go in a bank and your loan gets declined, but you don't have a transparency around why it was declined. If you were to have that transparency, maybe you can go and question it. Or in the case of healthcare, if there was an example of a lady with a disability that all of a sudden her caretaker hours were cut in half. That was from the US. And there was no transparency. All they could do is put numbers and put them through an algorithm, and they got a reply back on the number of hours this lady had to have her caretaker at home. But she could not challenge it because it was not transparent to say that was the reason why we think you should cut down to X number of hours. So by having this transparency, you can go and challenge or even change the outcome that may impact your life. The second of all, as I mentioned, accountability. So transparency and accountability go hand in hand. And when a model makes a wrong or rogue decision, knowing the factors and having that transparency that caused the decision may help avoid and skip altogether similar situations in the future. Inspection and traceability, actions undertaken by AI systems will enable humans to get into AI decision loops and have the ability to stop or control its tasks whenever need arises. Again, remember the case of feedback loops through the bot. Compliance, XAI is critical for data scientists, auditors, and business stakeholders to ensure compliance with company policies, industry standards, and importantly, regulations, and trust. Sorry, trust is going to come about in pretty much each of the sections that we get to discuss today. It helps promote end user trust, model auditability, and productive use of AI. It also mitigates compliance, legal, security, and reputational risks when it comes to productionizing AI. And now on the more technical side of explainability. So, and again, transparency, as we saw, could be almost achieved with either models for reporting or even with companies open sourcing their code. But open sourcing your code is one part of the whole story. It doesn't show you why one particular decision was made. And luckily for us, there have been some approaches within the AI community that try to overcome that black box phenomenon. So the idea is very simple. If you can get away with building a simple model without jeopardizing your accuracy, the decision-making process, then you should totally do that. It's advisable that you always start with a simple model because simpler models are much more easy to explain. If that's not the case, and along the lines of deep learning and more advanced models, you go down the road of more complex models, then what we're trying to achieve is some post hoc explanations. And we create what we call explainers. Some of the libraries that are commonly used within our communities, like Lime, Shap. There's also, again, from IBM and Microsoft, some toolkits that you can use. But the idea is you have your black box model, which is extremely complex, and you almost want to create a second model, a simple one, that is trying to approximate the results of that of your black box model, in order to create some interpretability. So in this case, for instance, if we think of this healthcare example, we have a model, we have given it some features of a patient, which are the symptoms, and that has to do with sneezing, the weight, headache, fatigue, and age. And we want to build a model that can predict, based on these characteristics, the symptoms, if someone has the flu or not. So the model does its work and gives us a result. So we build a second model, the explainer, in this case, for instance, using Lime, one of the libraries publicly available out there. And this gives us, on a feature by feature basis, the importance of each one of the features contributing to this result. So for instance, the existence of sneeze and headache and the lack, I'm not sure if you can see it because it's a different color, but the lack of no fatigue give us an explanation on why we think that person has the flu. Now, these explanations are later on passed to the human who does that final decision. So again, another point to remember here is the human in the loop element. Yes, it's great that we have explanations. Yes, it's great that we have super powerful models, but human in the loop element is extremely important. The final decision in this case lies with the medical expert. Last topic, very important, ethics. So let's start by looking at one of the cases from Facebook that has to do with advertising. In 2019, by the way, these two cases that are coming up have to do with Facebook. I have nothing against Facebook. It just happened to be some good examples to use. But the first one, as I mentioned, has to do with advertising. So in 2019, Facebook was allowing its advisors, which were third-party companies, to intentionally target ads, especially when it came to housing, employment, and credit, on the basis of gender, race, and religion. And these sensitive attributes, these sensitive features, are all protected under US law. They're legally protected classes. Of course, Facebook announced it would stop allowing doing that, but we have to bear in mind that Facebook ads are served to over 2 billion users. So in the cases, for instance, of employing. It was showing certain job descriptions, such as, I think it was secretarial descriptions to women, and for truck drivers, it would only be shown to male. So this, over the years, of course, has stopped, but nevertheless, again, it brings us to that case of the ethical part. Can we use these sensitive attributes? And if so, how? And also the element of bias that we discussed very early on. The second one, a lot more complex and probably the most famous example that has gone wrong over the past couple of years. In case you haven't come across it, I suggest you read about it or view the relevant documentary. And it has to do with digital profiling and data privacy. And this is the scandal around Facebook and its collaboration with Cambridge Analytica. So Facebook, even nowadays, is desperately trying to mend its damaged reputation following the continued fallout of a massive data scandal. Alongside the London-based election consultancy, so Cambridge Analytica was specializing when it had to do with the digital profiling, the psychological profiling of the voters. What happened initially is, like, a few years back, approximately 320,000 US voters, they were paid to take a detailed personality political test that required to launch this test by using the Facebook accounts. Now, not only did the app collect the data of these people, it collected likes and personal information directly from their Facebook accounts, but even worse, it collected data from their friends without them even knowing. And that ended up into approximately 50 million Facebook records being collected. And I recall there was another publication that stated it may as well be up to 80 million users worth of data. Of course, a couple of years ago, Facebook did change their policy to always require consent from, let's say, the friends of that particular person. However, in retrospect, these acquired data did not get deleted as they should have. And now what happened on the back of that is, as I mentioned, they started creating, and there's a lot of debate around how these digital profiles and how these data were used in principle. There's talks around even being used towards the US elections and Brexit, among others. But the key idea is, like, you create a digital profile of a user, and you don't want to just focus on users, let's say, that are in states that do not have an impact on the actual outcome of the election, but you want to really focus your energy on those that may have an impact. For instance, states like Florida, we all know that they may have a massive impact on the outcome of these results. And even though this may seem a bit of far-fetched, and everyone may say, but how does that affect my business? Again, especially working in the recommender scene for quite some time, there's always that fine line, those kind of gray area customers. Where does that individuality stop, and where does the ethical dilemma come in? So it's something that it makes me always question, always think the decisions that we have to make. So let's jump into the AI ethical part. And I need to mention here that ethics is not a legal or corporate compliance. So something that is legal does not necessarily mean that it's ethical, and something that is ethical does not necessarily mean that it's legal. And neither a set of fixed rules to follow, because not all sets of rules can cover all the cases of ethics. It's also not a purely negative frame. It's not someone like your mom, I don't know, saying, don't do this or don't do that. It's far more than that. And there's no sense of subjectivity, subjective sense of right and wrong. It's not like, oh, you have your ethics and I have mine, therefore I go and like kill someone. So that's definitely not the case. Ethics is defined as a set of the moral principles that are governing the behavior and the actions of an individual and group. In the case of AI, it's a set of values, principles, and techniques that employ widely accepted standards of what we consider right and wrong to guide this moral conduct in the development, and again, like throughout the life cycle of AI. The reason behind that is because, remember, AI brings amazing opportunities, but also incredible responsibility, especially in cases where someone's lives may be impacted. Think about the law, think about healthcare, or even like in the context of business. The output of AI systems, as I mentioned, has that real impact on people's lives. And it raises considerable questions around AI ethics, data governance, trust, as always, and legality. And only by embedding on a day-by-day basis into our line of business and our lives, ethical principles into these AI applications and processes, we can truly build systems that are based on trust. You get to hear trust a lot, believe me. Now, principles, in order to be impactful, because otherwise they're just a piece of wording, they must be broken down into specific and actionable policies and standards around teams, around which teams can execute. Without these, companies may fail to translate those principles into some tangible actions. So as with the case of the biases and creating fairness teams, it's advisable to have ethics teams. In fact, you can call them FAT teams, so fairness, accountability, and ethics, among others. Some people call them, or some companies rather, refer to them as RAI, responsible AI teams. And make sure that these are the norm and not the exception. It's not a surprise that the biggest technology companies have their own FAT/RAI companies. And among others, there are multidisciplinary teams of senior level, which are responsible for driving, for changing the scene of AI ethics in an organization. But they also have that team culture of responsibility and the company's kind of own flavor and conduct. And based on research online, what they suggest is that they should contain at a minimum technologists, because they know the tech stack available and how to mitigate risks around tech within a company, legal and compliance experts, ethicists, and of course, the business leaders in your organization that they know the values of the organization, the monetization, the strategy, among others. Given the varying values of companies across dozens of industries, of course, it's not a simple solution. So a data and ethics program must be tailored to a particular business, and the regulatory requirements do change as well throughout the globe and throughout different lines of businesses. But building an AI ethics team or a responsibility team in-house is one thing. However, companies especially should bear in mind that they should either reach out and collaborate, or at least follow or consult or advise or be in the lookout of what's happening in the AI ethics community. And I know this one is hard to read, but don't worry, I can provide you with the links after the presentation. This is two of the proposals from Fast AI, the 10 ethics experts to follow. There are some of the amazing people in the field, like Kate Crawford. I happened to see her NIPS keynote speech a couple of years ago in person. So these are truly the experts you should be looking on the lookout for, and they do publish a lot of research around that, and they do give a lot of guidelines and frameworks around how to best build those FAT practices. Very similarly with institutes like the Harvard Institute, AI Now, or the Alan Turing Institute, they do publish very frequently some very nice go-to standards and practices around ethical AI. But as we mentioned before, what we want to do as a company, as a business, as individuals, is have some AI principles to work around. And these principles, for example, the ones that were defined by Google around ethics and responsibility, they first and foremost kind of discuss the things that we discussed so far. So do focus around fairness. avoid creating and, of course, avoid reinforcing any unfair biases, and focus on the accountability. Try to have and uphold high standards of scientific excellence, do innovate responsibly, but try to be socially beneficial for the greater human good. AI systems should respect human rights, diversity, and autonomy. And we want to incorporate privacy design principles and safety. So these are, I would say, privacy and safety, security are some of the concepts that we'll see in a very little bit, which kind of it takes us from ethics all the way to responsibility and a trustworthy AI. And of course, there are 80, or if not more, published principles. This is a search conducted by BCG, but the difficulty still lies in operationalizing these principles. And as I mentioned previously, according to those principles, remember the example that we saw before when it came to biases for kind of gender neutral languages. So in line with Google's AI principles that emphasize on the first element in particular to avoid creating and reinforcing these biases, Google did take some steps to offer gender alternatives with explanation. That's the reason why I wanted to wait long enough to post that here. So you cannot really see from the screenshot, but they do have a justification on why you get those two results. So you have both the female and the male translation in this case, because that was a gender bias, along with an explanation. So that was a Spanish to English translation featuring both cases of gender. Besides company principles, there was a great initiative. I would say these must be like the go-to AI principles for beneficial AI that happened a couple of years ago, where more than 100 thought leaders and researchers from economics, law, ethics, philosophy met at that Asilomar conference to discuss, address, and formulate the principles of beneficial AI. And I have to say, in this case, the people that did take part are super impressive, from the DeepMind CEO, Demis Hassabis, but all the way to Elon Musk and Steve Hawking. So all kind of signed that they agree that these are the AI principles we should abide to. However, the outcome, as I mentioned, was a set of guidelines for AI research for beneficial AI. But these principles, of course, as we may expect, given the different domains and businesses, they may be applied inconsistently. And they may also create what we call the responsibility AI gap. And this gap is actually highlighting the gap in between what is a principle and how that becomes a practice. How do we move from these principles that can remain a piece of nice to have to some actions, some processes? Companies often do not know how to bridge that gap. So first of all, responsible AI principles should flow directly from a company's overall purpose and values, and they must be broken down into actionable policies and standards that the team can directly execute. So it's not just about sending it in an email or posting in-house that these are the values that we believe in. It needs to start cascading all the way down and becoming almost like a day-by-day life and training, so that everyone from C-levels all the way to like the developers, interns, they know, well, the values, the conduct, and like the areas that we can work within, and how do we apply those standards on a day-by-day basis in our work. So principle left alone can be elusive and impractical for applications, but this is where luckily ethical frameworks can help come into the rescue and provide a structure that helps drive and guide these sort of solutions, where we take that theory of the principles and make them actionable and operationalize upon those ethical principles. And there's a plethora of ethical practices and frameworks online. Again, like I have a couple of sources to recommend. But some of the most prominent examples of responsible AI frameworks include, among others, from the UK government, the Data Ethics Framework, UNESCO's recommendation on ethics in AI, and many, many more. I also have provided a link underneath. It does state "oh my" at the end because there's so many to choose from. But at least based on my knowledge so far, there's no universally accepted best practices when it comes to AI frameworks. So these are some of the go-to in case you're interested in. Now, as I mentioned, privacy and security are two different topics as well that we need to consider while building a responsible AI. Equally important to ethics and everything that we've discussed so far. Data security mainly focuses around keeping the data safe when it comes to hacker attacks, unauthorized accesses, and corruption. Whereas data privacy, almost within the remits of data protection, is an area that includes how do we best handle sensitive information and how do we deal with very protected, legally protected, almost confidential data. And on the second note, how do we abide, respect legal and regulatory requirements, for instance, in our case, GDPR, but also act within the social norms and the typical individual expectations. And the graph that I wanted to highlight here, which is of great interest, is that the number of posts that had to deal with data privacy. So how often did people search for data privacy before and right after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where we had that massive data breach? So you clearly see that spike there, and that is where people started becoming fearful and asking a lot of tough questions on how their data are being handled. Now, what I found interesting, especially when it comes to privacy practices, again, I get to use Google sources a lot, but I have to admit they are the pioneers. I mean, they're very, very good at what they're doing. How do we go about and deal with those privacy principles now, and how do we execute them on a day-by-day basis, while respecting legal and regulatory requirements? So what if you're in a line of business that you're handling sensitive data, such as finance or healthcare? The first is to think about the data collection, as we mentioned before. You need to collect and handle, most importantly, data responsibly. Ask yourself the right questions. Identify whether your AI model can get away with using none of this sensitive data. And if you do have to use them, could you get away with learning by using at least a minimal amount of sensitive data? If you cannot, then handle this sensitive data with extreme care, comply with laws, regulations, standards, and above all, again, going back to some of the examples that we discussed today, do give clear notice and the necessary control back to the user on how they want to handle their data. And of course, cases of using encryption, anonymization, and other formats that we've been using for quite some time. Remove anything that could be considered even a personal identifier, and any other, again, proxies in your metadata that can help de-anonymize. A bit of a funny side story. I remember a couple of years ago when working in healthcare, we had an image of a retina, very, very close one that for each and every one of us is just an eye. But for the trained individual, the medical expert that we had in the group, that was a big no-no, because that particular person had a condition that you could pinpoint it down to the individual just by looking at that figure. So that kind of made me rethink about things, and always, again, advise the people that do know better when it comes to different fields. The second of all, leverage on device processing where appropriate. So that means there is a booming over the last few years of trying to make the most out of your phones. Your phones are like little computers that we can crunch numbers and even run models on them if we can do. So if that's the case, could we get away with running some models And instead of sending raw data from you back to our servers, we can start sending signals and statistics, aggregated statistics, for example, that are calculated on your device, and send these sort of signals, which are on an aggregated basis, back to the model to ingest. Very similarly with federated learning, where same process happens. We run models across different machines, individual machines, and then we aggregate the output or signals from the models rather than the raw data. And last but not least, safeguard the privacy of your ML models. Estimate if the AI model is unintentionally memorizing or exposing sensitive data, and follow best practices when it comes to cryptography and security critical software. Again, AI does not deviate far off from any other software and technological process. Now, I know that I focused a lot on the negative side of things, and hopefully that sort of started showing you some of the steps that we can take towards that direction. And it's true that while algorithmic biases, risks, and challenges are increasing exponentially at a tremendous rate over time, luckily nowadays global governments, companies, and even all of us are taking the necessary steps towards preventing the actual use of unethical AI. Judiciaries and governments across the globe are passing new bills and making laws to monitor any unethical data usage and algorithms. For example, even here in Europe, we have GDPR. That scenery is trying to change across the world. And in 2021, 193 members of the UNESCO adopted a historic agreement defining the common principles and values required to ensure a healthy development of AI, creating an infrastructure for safe AI. But what I wanted to highlight is the two final points. So first and foremost, big tech companies that have been at the forefront, have been the pioneers of AI research nowadays and all its innovation. They have very actively started thinking about the side effects of their AI algorithms. And not only have they created fat or responsible AI teams, but they have started increasingly turning down projects or collaborations that may lead into, or rather on account of ethical concerns. So if something can be caused as a red flag, they may not even pick it up. And last but not least, some of the top AI conferences, NIPS included, started introducing, among others, for the publications that are being submitted. They have a whole new ethical committee. They have ethical conducts and standards on ethics and societal impact. So alongside with your published research, you now have to provide documentation and justify that your work is going to be ethical and beneficiary and be there for the greater good. If not, again, it has to go through the committee and you have to justify your views on that. But at least you can see that across the industry, it steps in the right direction. So with that in mind, some of the key takeaways I would like to kind of finalize with and leave you with today is, first of all, as we mentioned, understand and be on the constant lookout for biases, not just when it comes to data, not when it comes to model, but throughout the AI lifecycle. Do act ethically and innovate responsibly. I know that at times we want to use the most powerful techniques and feed all the data that we want in this model to boost that accuracy and performance and really reach those promised KPIs. But we do have to consider responsibility very actively, because if something does go wrong, remember, it may lead to legal complications, fines, and worst of all, the reputational damage for the company that we work with. Do think like an auditor. Keep asking the right tough questions. Be open with your team of experts. I'm particularly annoying all the time, not just with on a professional level, but even with friends. I start picking up on things on whether they're fair or biased, and our society could do better. But do think in that right mindset. It's the job of all of us here. Remember, it's not a technology thing, it's a society thing. So the change needs to start from all of us, as cliche as it may sound. And do remember, for those of us that work in the field or want to implement and make the most out of these AI algorithms, with great power comes great responsibility. So with that, I would like to thank you for your time, and a bit of a funny banter up there. And of course, we can open gradually for questions. And some of the selected resources.
Hi, hello.
Hello.
So let me just start by saying thank you very, very much. For me, it was very, very nice, very well presented, delivered. And although I don't have any specific knowledge on the subject, it made me feel that I now understand a little bit better. We have opened since the beginning some questions. It's really tough to select something because you managed to cover so many things within this presentation. But we would like to start with one question that I think encompasses a little bit a few. Could you just remind us what are the basic principles? We don't want an elaboration this time, but like, as you said, key takeaways so that we remember what you said, what are the important things that we should consider in responsible AI?
So with the trust as the core element that we want to build, we want to start building responsible AI. And the main pillars, as a very nice recap that we covered today, is first and foremost, act fairly. So be on the constant lookout for biases, stereotypes, prejudices in your algorithms. So first one, fairness. Second of one, accountability that goes hand in hand with transparency. We need to build our algorithms in a way that it can provide human explanations, justify why the model has taken the approach it has taken. And last but not least, we need to act ethically. So ethics is something that lives in all of us, not just in governments, not just in companies, but I want to believe that we're all ethical human beings and we can detect right from wrong. So very similarly, apply those ethical values into the whole model building of AI. On the back of that, so besides those four main pillars that we covered today, security and data privacy issues are also of paramount importance. We need to think how to best handle very sensitive, confidential data on a day-by-day basis on the job. But AI, and I know that the presentation today has mainly focused on the negative side of AI, but AI can really achieve some amazing things when it comes to automation, when it comes to prediction. So I hope that by building AI in a responsible and beneficial fashion, that we all get to enjoy the beautiful outcomes that can come out of that.
Thank you very much. That was very, very nicely said. So from what I understand, and I take the last part from what you said, is that we need to be able to use AI more, but to do that, we must first understand the principles, enforce them, and then we can actually get the benefits of AI. So first understand, which is what we are trying to do, what you're helping us to do, and then implement, and then we'll have a positive value. That's great. Now, some of our audience, some of our chapter members are auditors like myself. So we always come back to questions like, okay, that's nice, but how do we audit this? So can you give us an idea? Like, I know it's not going to be a straightforward answer. But any ideas about how to audit this?
No, of course not. And I'm no expert, again, when it comes to auditing. I think, as I mentioned, it's very important to work in a close collaboration with people from different backgrounds, so that, for instance, developers, they know what the auditors are asking for. So briefly mentioned across the various pillars, some techniques that may help the auditing process when it comes to data collection and handling, and also the model building process. But in particular, in the last section of responsibility and ethical AI, there's a lot of frameworks and principles in place, and there were way too many to include in the presentation. So I think I have like a couple more examples. This was one of the cases that I mentioned with the ethical frameworks. I do encourage you to go to that page. It's by Salesforce, and have a look, because this is a compiled version of principles, frameworks. It's pretty much like an auditor's happy place. It does have a lot of background, it breaks it down into different categories. I encourage you to go and have a look. There's, again, from the various institutes that I kind of prompted you to follow, and the ethics experts out there, there's research around accountability toolkits and impact assessments. I must have read a lot these days, and it was truly really hard to cherry pick these. So I can come back and have some suggestions you can walk away with. But I think good starting points are, as I mentioned, follow those ethics experts. They're posted on Fast AI ethics page. They tend to post a lot, and they do collaborate with legal teams, with auditors, with governments. They do post a lot around these toolkits and frameworks and policies, but also do advise pages like that have done that research. I think that was lastly updated only a couple of months ago. So very much keeping up to date with like the latest standards in the field.
Thank you very much. That's great. As you said, it's an auditor's playground.
I was trying to find the best way to compile it and show you, because there was such a huge list, but I do encourage you to have a look, and I'm more than happy to share the list of resources after today's talk if you need that.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great. Actually, we like to read, but we like to have also tools that help us implement stuff. So yes, please share. So moving on. So when we do an audit, we have actually possible outcomes. One of them is how to reach the conclusion that it's okay. So when do we stop? How do we say that this AI is responsible, everything's okay?
Well, responsibility, and again, that I know that we're shifting towards artificial general intelligence, where the AI can learn to automate and do pretty much everything on their own. But in order to be truly responsible, the human in the loop still needs to be featured in. So where does it stop? Never, probably never, because the last thing we want, that doesn't mean that we have to be on the constant lookout like every single second, but we need to be on a constant lookout on when something could go wrong. Have screening in place, automated screening. So at times what is suggested is like we use AI for AI. So things like the auditing aspect, we can apply some sort of tools and techniques that can keep an eye and really flag and send to the auditor when something has gone terribly wrong. So we can almost use technology to help a technology's problem in cases like that. But nevertheless, a human needs to be on a constant lookout when things do go wrong.
So that means, as you said, and I like that quote, with great power comes great responsibility. So we need to be there and be responsible for what is happening and intervene and have the humans also there. So that's great. Thank you. And that brings me to the last question, I think, because I've taken too much time. Okay.
And one side note in the previous question, if I may remember that again, I may very much answer these as, the tech expert in the group. Someone else may be thinking it from an auditor point of view, but this is a huge societal problem or issue rather. So we need different types of expertise to deal with these sort of cases. So it's a very complex problem and it's not an easy one to be solved.
I understand. So to the last point, it has to do with when things go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So what about that part? And let me just try to combine two questions in one. Sorry, everybody. So how you said that we can use AI to check AI, we can use algorithms to check algorithms to help us get information in order for a human to intervene. What about when something goes wrong, when the result is wrong,
Mm-hmm.
when we have cases like the ones that you showed today?
Mm-hmm. I think, as we mentioned, cases like that may lead to very uncomfortable situations with great damage, either reputational or monetary or legal. But I think, and I cannot raise this enough, the shift nowadays needs to be not how we can mitigate or deal with when something goes wrong, but how can we prevent something going wrong? So learning from the past and learning from these mistakes and having, of course, regulations and legal and laws catching up with this huge field that it's just at its infancy. The idea is like we want to kind of pause or stop the problem or catch it before it's out there in the wilderness. And based on publications that I've read, and if you wanted my own personal belief, this is the big win. How do you stop something before it's out there that it's too hard to rectify on the back of that? So I think stronger screening in place, stronger auditing, like learning from these mistakes of the past and the issues that we've seen all over the news, and try to address the situation before it actually happens.
That's great. Thank you very much. Okay. So it's not just about the algorithms learning. We have to learn also our systems, our legal frameworks, our standards, our auditors, our security professionals. We should be learning and improving and to make the best of it.
Absolutely. And it's only in the last few years that I know for tech companies, and AI has been on and off in the radar since the 70s, but for the tech companies, they're way ahead of the curve and it's their line of business. But for different types of businesses, especially the ones that deal with sensitive confidential data that are also highly regulated, it's still at infancy level. So we're still very much like learning how can we apply AI to automate and help with any prediction and decision-making models in cases. So we're still learning, and it's a huge educational curve that we all have to go through, each wearing a different hat. I go around and preach about data science, or I'm an advocate of data science, but also say, oh, look, I think of it in an ethical way. But it's, again, very much a cross-team collaboration of people with different backgrounds, different expertise from different kind of minority groups and different legally protected groups to really understand this in a 360 view, this problem in a 360 view, this issue rather, not problem.
Thank you very much. I have millions of questions, but I'm going to stop here. Thank you very, very much.
Welcome. Thank you very much.
Before we close, we want to thank you, everybody, for joining this event this evening. A big applause once again to Elena for this insightful, really insightful presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. We're just going to say you stay engaged with our chapter and try to interact as much as you can through our digital media so we can do something better. And stay alerted because some new events are going to follow. and which will be announced shortly. Thank you very much and good night.